Berlin, 1921. A schoolteacher named Heinrich Hoffmann walks into a bakery with a leather satchel. Inside it, enough paper marks to buy a loaf of bread. 6 months later, he walks into the same bakery with a wheelbarrow. Same loaf, same baker. The number on the notes has simply grown by a factor that his mathematics training cannot make feel real. Heinrich is not a fool. He is not lazy. He saved. He planned. He did everything the system told him to do. He is being systematically destroyed by a mechanism he cannot see, cannot name and cannot escape, because the mechanism is the system itself. This is not a story about hyperinflation. You already know that word. This is a story about 4 specific wealth destruction engines that Weimar Germany ran simultaneously against its own middle class. And about the parallel playbook, documented in private bank records, SEC equivalent filings, and the forensic archaeology of German industrial history, that a small group of people ran in the opposite direction. One of the 4 mechanisms is still operating today, not as a historical curiosity, as policy. The German middle class of 1914 was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most financially prudent populations in the industrialized world. The savings rate among German households in the years preceding the First World War was extraordinary. Bank deposits, government bonds, life insurance policies, the German bourgeoisie had built its identity around financial discipline and deferred gratification. That identity became the weapon used against it. Between 1919 and November 1923, the German mark lost 99.99999% of its value. The numbers are so extreme they stop feeling real. In 1919, $1 bought 48 marks. By November 1923, $1 bought 4.2 trillion marks, not billion, trillion. Every mark sitting in a savings account, every mark represented by a government bond, every mark embedded in a life insurance payout was incinerated in real terms. Not stolen overtly, not confiscated by decree, simply made worthless through the mechanical expansion of the money supply by a government that could not pay its war reparations obligations any other way. The forensic detail that never appears in standard accounts is this: the destruction was not uniform. It was precisely targeted by asset class. Paper claims on money, savings accounts, bonds, insurance contracts, fixed pensions went to zero. Hard assets, land, buildings, industrial machinery, foreign currency holdings, gold, held. Their real value or appreciated dramatically when measured in any stable monetary unit. The German middle class held paper. The German industrial elite held hard assets. That distribution was not accidental. It reflected decades of differential access to financial instruments that the middle class had been culturally conditioned to distrust as speculative and morally suspect. The Protestant savings ethic, the cultural backbone of German bourgeois identity, had perfectly positioned an entire class for annihilation by precisely the instrument it had been trained to trust most: the savings account. Friedrich Kreuger, a Berlin accountant whose personal records were preserved by the German Historical Institute, documented his family's destruction with meticulous precision. In 1918, his savings represented enough purchasing power to buy a comfortable house in the suburbs of Berlin. By 1923, the same nominal balance could not purchase a single postage stamp. 5 years. A lifetime of discipline, gone with mathematical completeness. The savers did not survive Weimar, the debtors did. And the mechanism behind that reversal is the second engine. Here is the fact that rewrites every conventional narrative about Weimar Germany, and you will almost certainly never encounter it in a mainstream financial publication. The hyperinflation did not destroy all wealth equally. It destroyed creditor wealth systematically while simultaneously gifting debtor wealth with a mechanism so precise it reads like deliberate engineering. Hugo Stinnes understood this before almost anyone. By 1923, Stinnes had assembled the largest private industrial empire in German history. Coal mines, steel mills, newspapers, shipping lines, hotels, a conglomerate spanning 4,554 separate business entities. He did not build this empire from existing wealth. He built it almost entirely on borrowed marks, borrowed at fixed nominal rates, and repaid in marks worth fractions of what he had borrowed. The mechanics are straightforward once you see them. A manufacturer borrows 10 million marks in 1920 to acquire a factory. The loan is denominated in marks. By 1923, 10 million marks is worth less than a streetcar ticket. He repays the loan in nominal marks. The factory remains. The debt has been inflated to nothing. He now owns productive industrial capacity, free and clear, acquired with borrowed money that the inflation rendered functionally costless to repay. This was not a loophole that a clever few discovered. It was a structural property of the monetary collapse that anyone could have accessed, in theory. In practice, access to the scale of credit that made this mechanism transformative required existing relationships with German banks that were, themselves, navigating the collapse. The industrial elite had those relationships. The middle class did not. The small business owner, the craftsman, the shopkeeper, these were the creditors of the system. They had extended trade credit to customers. They held receivables denominated in marks. As those marks collapsed, their receivable portfolios collapsed with them. The money owed to them became worthless faster than they could collect it. Adam Fergusson's documentation of this period in When Money Dies traces the social consequences with forensic precision. The Mittelstand, the German middle class, did not simply lose money during Weimar. It lost its structural position in the German economy. The businesses that survived were those with access to foreign currency reserves or hard asset collateral, properties, mineral rights, agricultural land that allowed them to borrow and repay in a collapsing currency while retaining real assets acquired with that borrowed purchasing power. This was not capitalism functioning as designed. This was capitalism malfunctioning in a specific direction, toward those already holding institutional leverage and away from those holding only the promise of future paper payment. By 1922, the German population had begun to understand what was happening to their savings. The knowledge arrived too late to matter. The pivot to hard assets, the rational response to currency destruction, was itself structured to exclude the middle class by the time the danger was broadly recognized. Here is the sequence. In the early stages of the inflation from 1919 to 1921, hard asset prices in mark terms remained relatively stable. The inflation had not yet become obvious to ordinary households whose mental anchors remained fixed on pre-war price levels. Gold, real estate, and foreign currency were available at prices that, in retrospect, represented extraordinary value in real terms. The industrial and financial elite, whose professional lives were organized around monitoring these price signals, precisely moved early. They converted mark-denominated holdings into hard assets, while the middle class was still calculating in pre-war purchasing power equivalents. By 1922, as the inflation became impossible to ignore, the middle class attempted the same pivot. But the price of that pivot had already moved. Real estate prices in mark terms were rising exponentially. Gold was trading at premiums that reflected the desperate demand of millions of households suddenly competing for the same finite supply of non-paper assets. The window had closed, not by conspiracy, by the structural advantage of those who read price signals earlier, moved capital faster, and held the institutional relationships that provided access to hard asset markets before those markets became crowded with panicked savers. The Reichsbank's own archives, studied by historian Harold James in The German Slump, document the differential timing of capital movement with uncomfortable clarity. Corporate accounts began systematic conversion of mark holdings to foreign currency and real assets beginning in late 1920. Individual household accounts show the same movement beginning in late 1922. A 2-year gap. Timing is not intelligence. Timing is access. And access was distributed exactly as you would expect it to be distributed in a system built by and for those who already held the most. The middle class did not fail to protect itself because it was financially unsophisticated. It failed because the information asymmetry built into the system meant that by the time the danger was legible, the exit was already expensive. November 15, 1923. The Rentenmark is introduced. 1 Rentenmark equals 1 trillion old marks. Hyperinflation ends with a suddenness that feels almost surgical. The conventional account treats this as rescue. It was rescue for those who had survived the inflation with hard assets intact. For those who had not, the stabilization introduced a 4th and final destruction mechanism that the historical literature almost never names directly. Call it the stabilization trap. When the Rentenmark replaced the old mark, economic activity needed to restart. Businesses needed working capital, individuals needed liquidity, credit needed to flow. The Rentenbank was constrained in its issuance by the explicit political commitment to avoid the inflation that had destroyed its predecessor. Currency. Credit was tight. Interest rates were high. Those with hard assets, industrial equipment, real estate, agricultural land, could collateralize loans in the new stable currency and access the credit they needed to resume operations. They moved immediately into the post-inflation economy from a position of strength. Those without hard assets had nothing to collateralize. They could not access credit at any price. They entered the stabilized economy holding nothing but their labor and whatever nominal Rentenmark savings they had managed to accumulate, competing for employment from businesses owned by the same industrial elite that had used the inflation to consolidate its position. The stabilization did not reset the economic hierarchy. It locked it in place. The economist Hjalmar Schacht, who engineered the stabilization as Reichsbank president, documented the human cost with clinical precision. The stabilization was economically necessary and socially catastrophic in approximately equal measure. Between 1919 and 1924, the German middle class had been run through 4 sequential destruction mechanisms. Its savings had been incinerated. Its position as creditor had been inverted against it. Its attempt to acquire hard assets had been priced out by those who moved earlier, and its recovery had been foreclosed by a credit environment that rewarded existing collateral and punished its absence. The standard lesson extracted from Weimar Germany is: hyperinflation is bad. Buy gold. Avoid paper money. That lesson is real but incomplete in ways that cost people fortunes in every subsequent monetary crisis. The deeper lesson is structural. Weimar didn't simply destroy savings. It ran 4 simultaneous mechanisms: savings, incineration, debt inversion, real asset lockout, and stabilization trap, each of which operated on a different timeline, targeted a different financial behavior, and required a different response. The middle class was destroyed not because it failed to respond. It failed because by the time each mechanism became visible, the window for an effective response had already closed. Information lag is not a Weimar problem. It is the permanent condition of every monetary system under stress. The gap between when institutional capital reads a signal and when household capital reads the same signal has never been zero. In every crisis since Weimar, the 1970s stagflation, the 2008 financial collapse, the post-2020 inflation, that gap has been the primary mechanism through which wealth transferred upward during what appeared from the outside to be indiscriminate destruction. Heinrich Hoffmann, the schoolteacher with the wheelbarrow, was not failed by his own choices. He was failed by a system that structured its collapse to benefit those already holding the structural advantages the collapse rewarded. The wheelbarrow is not a symbol of individual failure. It is a symbol of precisely engineered redistribution. Dressed in the language of economic inevitability, history doesn't repeat, but it does keep sending the same invoice. The question is whether you've read the previous statements carefully enough to know what's already been charged. Subscribe. We read the statements here so you know what's coming before it arrives.